Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back for session number 5 of North Park Theological Seminary's Symposium on the Bible and Politics. I'm Michelle Clifton Soderstrom, and I serve as the Dean of Faculty, and I'm delighted to moderate this session this afternoon. For our paper presenter, we have Dr. K. Higuera Smith, who is a professor in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies at Azusa Pacific School of Theology. And her respondent will be our own Dr. Bret Widman, who is Associate Professor of Ministry and Director of Contextual and Lifelong Learning here at North Park. And so with that, Dr. Higuera Smith, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you all. In line with this discussion about the Bible and politics, I want to talk about naming and the power to name. And something I've observed in the classroom is that a certain segment of Christianity here in the United States has so effectively claimed the name of Christian for themselves that they actually have convinced many other forms of Christians that they are not Christian. So in my classroom, and I teach undergrads, I often every semester hear students say, I'm Catholic, I'm not Christian. And what that tells me is that they have believed and internalized the message that a certain form of white evangelicalism dominates and controls the name Christian. And so that's one issue that I want to discuss about how the power to name is a political act. And it's also, of course, the power to interpret the Bible, the power to name the legitimate forms of how we interpret the Bible. All of this is political. And secondly, I want to argue that this is a problem because this particular form of Christianity is one that has used that power to inscribe a kind of social violence and to inscribe a racialized, anti-Jewish, gendered hierarchy. And I want to talk about how they've done that and the processes that are both ideological and epistemic. And then at the end, although at the very end, what are some ways we can deal with this or address this in a positive way? First of all, naming we often don't think about as a political act. One group of scholars has argued that it's a political act of ascribing identities to ourselves and others in ways that may liberate and may maintain, but also may dehumanize. And we have to test that claim and think about the name Christian and how in the 21st century in the United States, it's become a contested site for political activism. The reason this is important is because people are leaving churches in droves in the United States right now because they have become convinced that this particular contingent social group, which is actually numerically in the minority in the United States, that this social group defines what Christianity is, and people are selecting out of that. This is a problem for all of us. In 2020, white evangelical Protestant Christians made up only 7% of the 18 to 29 age demographic. And during the Trump era, white evangelical churches shrunk. This was really for the first time. Interestingly, mainline and Catholic churches grew during that period, which tells us that people are leaving the white evangelical churches for other forms of Christianity. That was good news because up until recently, they just left. They didn't even know that there were other forms of Christianity available for them. Now, the result of this kind of absolute dominance over the name Christian and this political domination of the discourse of Christianity and of biblical hermeneutics right now results in violence. I want to give you an example. I'm not sure if you're all aware of a particular white evangelical worship leader at Bethel Church in Redding, California. His name is Sean Fucht, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he tweeted about a worship rally he held in Portland, Oregon a few weeks ago. And he claimed there was an Antifa attack on a previous prayer rally. And this is what he tweeted. Thank you, and I'm quoting here, thank you to our security team, half pictured tonight in Portland. And then he gives an emoji of an American flag and a muscled arm. These are all ex-military, ex-police, private security, and most importantly, and here we have in all caps, lovers of Jesus and freedom. If you mess with them or our First Amendment right to worship God, you will meet Jesus one way or another. So here you see an extreme, certainly, form of violent rhetoric that's been put forth, but he is not alone in asserting his definition of quote unquote lovers of Jesus without irony and without apology. This is the kind of dominance of the social narrative that we're seeing right now. Along with the power to name comes other powers. The power to interpret the Bible, or the power to name one's own interpretation of the Bible as normative. Another power is the power to establish social norms, the norms of behavior, and most importantly, for our setting, the norms of that regulate social hierarchies. And so what appears innocent in this kind of naming actually becomes coercive when it sets these regulatory norms. And that happens in a lot of ways. The act of evangelizing itself is often a case of power over the other person. Often there's not a real effort to get to know the other person and their hopes and needs and dreams and urgent questions, but to impose upon them and to hopefully, in the case of the evangelizer, convince them with your knowledge over their knowledge that you are right. It comes with naming things as personal and political when the person is political. Another part of the power to name is the power to silence. There are myths, there are stories, and I use the word myths in the religious sense, not as things that are not true, but in the sense of being mythic. Mythic stories that shape how people think of themselves and who they see themselves to be in relation to God and the cosmos and other human beings. So the power to name is a power to silence the myths and the stories and the salient norms and values of other people, other Christians. So especially in the United States, Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, these kinds of groups, differently abled people, their stories, their mythic stories, their salient norms are often silent. And this is true even when those minoritized norms are equally a part of the social identity that we name as Christian. And we can see this in the data. For instance, we know that Black Christians are twice as likely as all Americans and 3 times more likely as white evangelicals to identify as Democrats. By the same token, only 22%, or let's say almost 80% of Black evangelicals did not have a favorable opinion of former President Trump, while as over 80% of white evangelicals did. So what that tells us is that when one group claims successfully and is able to convince others that they have the power to name what it is to be a Christian, then that means norms such as perspectives on race relations, police department funding, social services, immigration, all of those values that are important for other groups of Christians within the United States are named as peripheral and deviant by extension, by definition. A good example of this, one of the key voices in white evangelicalism is John Piper. And just in 2021, he wrote that the New Testament affirmed slavery, but that if it was to be followed, such slavery would have been transformed. So in his construction, all New Testament slaveholders were good, transformative people who treated their slaves beautifully. He fails to cite a single African-American biblical scholar on this issue and fails to recognize his own social location in making that claim. This example from Piper also goes to the issue of visibility and invisibility. His own racialized assumptions go unremarked and unnoticed by his followers. They're rendered invisible. And what is sad is so often, of course, people of color or Black, Indigenous people who are at these churches internalize those assumptions, and they deny the urgent questions that may have come out of their own social historical experience. We see this especially among women who accept biological determinism about women. I'll have more to say about that in a bit. But if people's core convictions are marked as deviant in churches or in particular biblical hermeneutical stances, then the result is social violence. And it happens one of two ways. In one way, they self-select out. They just say, I can't be in this space, and they leave. And many of them, as we've seen, do not find other churches. Or in some ways, it's even worse if they remain, because then they suffer, they're censored, they suffer silencing, and they have to endure constant microaggressions and policing in order to remain in that kind of a social space. So in all of these ways, the power to name is working in all sorts of ways to police and to control the boundaries and to regulate those norms in ways that really hurt people in their midst. Another way that this happens is through social memory, through deliberate social ignorance, and through creating myths and mystification. Social memory and social forgetting, deliberate social forgetting, are important tools for mystifying the power to name. And when I say mystify, I mean creating this sense among congregants and among associates that this power to name is somehow divinely ordained or naturally ordained. I'll give John Piper again as an example, because when he's writing about slavery, he's in 2021, he's writing about Jonathan Edwards, who was a slaveholder. And he himself acknowledges that he himself, as when he was in a learning mode, was a victim of collective ignorance, because he said he spent 20 years studying Jonathan Edwards, reading everything he had ever written, and yet he never knew until recently about Jonathan Edwards' slaveholding and support of slavery. And in this way, in some ways, he encourages others in their ignorance. He calls his own desire to see Jonathan Edwards in a positive light as wishful thinking. But John Piper grew up in a segregated Jim Crow town. He himself was educated in those environments. And not only is he a product of that, but he is perpetuating that kind of social ignorance. So his social environment not only deliberately forgot, and I put this in air quotes, Jonathan Edwards' slaveholding history, but also the injustices of slaveholding at large. Charles Mills defines this phenomenon as, quote, systemic misperception, unquote. And I think that is important. And I want to quote Mills here. He writes, what I want to pin down then is the idea of an ignorance, a non-knowing that is not contingent, but in which race, white racism, and or white racial domination and their ramifications play a causal role. Then he writes, to begin with, white ignorance as a cognitive phenomenon has to be clearly historicized. And this is one of the issues of the power to name. Those who want to name white evangelicalism as Christianity without any qualifiers at all, we have to challenge that by historicizing that, because white ignorance is a cognitive phenomenon. It's an epistemological claim. And Mills, who is an epistemologist, has argued that white ignorance is a form of active resistance against justices sought by Black and Indigenous and people of color. He calls it a conscious forgetting that occurs in order to contribute to the mystification of these social and hermeneutical spaces in which white norms dominate. He also calls these flawed processes of cognition because they result in real world moral damage to the social other who has become peripheralized in all of this. Now, key to also this form of the power to name is the power to establish hierarchies and mystify them as normative. So we see in white evangelicalism, male, female, Western, non-Western, white against Black, Indigenous, people of color, insider, outsider, for instance, Christian, non-Christian, American, quote unquote, versus the xenophobic other. So all of those who challenge these hierarchies get subject to its policing. And these claims get put forward as if they are not only divinely, but also biologically inevitable. So let me quote another one of these, one of the sort of caretakers of gatekeepers of the naming, Owen Strachan, who states, Christianity, quote, does indeed offer us models for manhood and womanhood, scripts for how we should live out our days to the glory of God and our sex, our gender. Men must not shun the work of provision for their wives and children. This role is given them of God. Women must not demean homemaking and child raising, such as their inheritance from the Lord. Of course, we see in this a bourgeois, upper class assessment of roles. Sometimes women living in poverty don't have the option to be home as a homemaker and a child. And so again, those women are stigmatized and peripheralized. So here is a case not only of selective forgetting, but also a selective hermeneutic that ignores much of Scripture while portraying certain favored passages through a particular hermeneutical lens, and no irony or apology or explanation of how that may be a contingent way. So the power to name then, and I'm going down to the second part of my talk now, is one of the most concerning really parts of the power to name is the way that it gets mystified throughout history by redefining the terms of the hierarchy and the epistemic assumptions that underwrite that hierarchy. So I want to argue is that as the hierarchy is maintained, it has to accept new epistemic realities. Possibly there are new scientific developments. Possibly there are new epistemological developments, such as the Enlightenment or modernity. And in all of these ways, what occurs is that the dominant group has been able to shift its norms and its epistemic framework to support the hierarchies that it demands, the social hierarchies, while at the same time claiming that those hierarchies are unchanging. We see this especially, for instance, when it comes to gender, the claim that, well, this is traditional. However, the terms on which contemporary gender hierarchies are established by some of those who are the gatekeepers of white evangelicalism have radically shifted in the modern period. And so I want to look at three categories. One is racism, one is anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and the third is gender. And of course, I am not giving a real thorough treatment of these. Some of the sources that I gave in my paper, if you download it, will be more thorough on this. I'm just barely touching the high points, but I think I can make my point nevertheless. And that is that, so let's take a look at those three. Now, on one case, I do want to mention sort of an irony in all of this, because patriarchy, anti-Semitism, and racism are Christian They have been with us since the beginning in some form. Racism, not so much, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But certainly anti-Jewishness and gender hierarchies. So in one sense, white evangelicals are being honest that they're looking at the traditional forms. But in the other sense, they're not being honest because the epistemic justifications for those hierarchies have shifted. So there's a cloaking and a masking of those epistemic changes. And that's what I want to talk about. So let's look at race just very briefly. In antiquity, skin color is sometimes a category for racial hierarchies, but most time it's one of many. It is not a primary indicator for social identity. And in my paper, I give examples of in the Roman era, it's education, observance of Roman law, morality, piety, citizenship. These often take a much greater role than skin color. Religious groups were categorized by race. The Jews were considered a genos, a race. Skin color sometimes was brought in, but it wasn't systematic. There's no evidence of any kind of pervasive sense of social hierarchy based on skin color alone. We also have the Aristotelian anthropologies of that period, which of course saw the Greek or Roman male as the fully rational human being. Females and barbarians were considered irrational, and this is based on a Neoplatonic also kind of way of thinking. And so in race, in the pre-modern period, skin color is not the way that race gets defined. Things shift with the Spanish Inquisition. Raza in Spanish now refers to Jews and Moors. And this is the first example when raza gets associated with purity of blood. We have this phrase, limpieza de sangre, which is purity of blood, which is used to define people who are descended from Jews and Moors by blood. Then we have slavery appealing to the natural order. In the 1600s, Cotton Mather makes claims about social hierarchies appealing to the natural order. But during the Enlightenment, you get a shift in the epistemic justification. Race now, based on skin color, becomes a major factor. And this is a combination of Enlightenment, also colonialism are operating here. But in the Enlightenment and in the 19th century, you have scientific racism, you have the pseudoscience of racism, you have the Wissenschaft period, when racial essences and social and cultural and religious essences were being taxonomized and hierarchized. So that the justification for race shifts. Then in the Jim Crow era, in the United States, you have legal innovations that have to account for the 13th and 14th Amendments. So slavery then gets shifted to indentured servitude and incarceration. There's a focus on segregation and private schools and home schools. These movements begin out of the movement to segregate. Civil rights era comes in the United States, and new justifications have to emerge because the old ones aren't making sense. So, and now I'm limiting myself, of course, to the United States. In the Reagan era, you have the drug laws and the stereotype of the welfare queen, which Bill Clinton doubles down on, by the way. George H.W. Bush exploits the myth of the dangerous Black man. During Obama's era, you have birtherism and xenophobia. And of course, in the Trump era, you have the demonizing of Black Lives Matter, the supporting of police brutality and calling it all lives matter or blue lives matter. The white evangelicals are at the forefront of all of this. You have the Southern Baptist Seminary presidents, academics supposedly decrying critical race theory while clearly demonstrating critical race theory's claims, by the way, and clearly not understanding it. So you have white evangelicals developing a racialized culture while at the same time denying racial concerns. The same thing happens in anti-Judaism. In antiquity, you have this notion that Jews lost the covenant and Christians gained it. Under Augustine, you have the ideology of Jews as Cain. So it's the church's responsibility not to destroy the Jews, but to maintain them as long as they stay in an oppressed state. You have in the medieval period what one source calls, Peter Schaeffer calls Judeophobia, where Jews are constructed as misanthropic and monstrous. Of course, in the Spanish Inquisition, now you get this idea of Jews as a biologically distinct entity with different blood, which has to be purged. The Enlightenment is really interesting because Jews at first welcomed it. They called it the Haskalah, the emancipation. Now they had civil rights. But of course, very quickly, the dominant culture recognized that even though Jews had the same civil rights, they didn't assimilate with them like they expected them to. So they assumed then that there must be something biologically innate and perfidious about Jews in their blood. And therefore, they must ultimately in the 20th century, they must be annihilated, they must be destroyed. Even contemporary dispensationalist Christian Zionism, in my view, is a form of anti-Jewishness because it argues that 2/3 of all the Jews are going to be annihilated in the eschaton. And so the goals and the aspirations of Jews are not considered. Christian Zionists have their own interests and their own biblical interpretations. And of course, this objectification of real Jews is even more marked and more violent in Christian Zionist objectification of contemporary Palestinians and their plight. So here again, all of these efforts to mask the objectification and the exploitation of Israelis and Palestinians is just one more example of mystification. And finally, when it comes to gender, we see the same thing. The patriarchy, the hierarchy exists, but the epistemic arguments that justify it shift. So in the Hebrew Bible, the narrators take it as a given that patriarchal hierarchies exist, but they love to tell stories and to honor smart, resourceful women who overcome this system. In the New Testament, we see a reassertion of, or an assertion of Aristotelian anthropology, especially if you think of the household codes. We also see the public-private ideologies of honor and shame operating in the New Testament. But women were able to get around this by advocating virginity and celibacy. So they would go out and preach often and teach, and certainly they paid a price. But by the same token, they were able. There was a get around in that system. After the Protestant Reformation, though, you get this mystification of the married state for women as their highest calling, and we see a social forgetting of the preaching virgins of the previous era, and the gender hierarchies actually get even more rigid. The Enlightenment, we get this pseudoscience about women as the weaker sense. And then to jump forward, and I know I'm making huge leaps here, so please forgive me. To say all this in half an hour is absurd, really, but I hope my greater point is being made. And now, of course, we get the contemporary movement of complementarianism. And even Russell Moore, himself a complementarian, the Southern Baptist, well, he's left the Southern Baptist now, but even he admitted that the movement is just another name for patriarchy, but it cloaks and masks its patriarchy by claiming that women and men are equal, they just have different roles. So it creates a hierarchy by doing that and really supports and mimics the separate but equal racial hierarchies of the 1960s. It's just another example of a new epistemology, and it still maintains a biological determinism that females biologically are determined throughout history to be subordinated to men. And so we see this subordination of women getting maintained and being achieved consistent with the cult of domesticity of the Protestant Reformation. So to wrap all this up, white evangelicals have created new epistemic claims to reinforce their regulatory norms, their ideological interests, and their social hierarchies. But they've done this in some ways in bad faith, while still claiming that while, yes, they do acknowledge that they are not the same as previous Christians, they still assert an unchanging core of what Christianity is, and that they can define that, and that they can define the hermeneutic that go with it. Is there any way forward? Well, it's tough. Breaking an ideology's hold is one of the hardest things, but we can learn our history. We understand that social memory shapes identity, and we have to put that history out. We have to continue to push for critical race theory and other critical theories that give us the tools to name these kind of cloaked and masked systemic forms of constructing violent hierarchies. We need to point out the logical inconsistencies repeatedly. And we need to see this as a decades-long and possibly centuries-long challenge. It may be that Christianity and those who follow in the steps of Christendom is too compromised. I struggle with that. Are these hierarchies so built into the warp and woof that we can never extricate? A good case can be made, and has been made by many. I guess I'll be honest, maybe I'm engaging in my own wishful thinking. There is something that compels me about the teachings of Jesus and the Hebrew Bible that can be very powerful, that speaking of the voice of the oppressed, of the outsider. But I don't think the way that social identity movements operate in this world, that voice will ever be more than a small minority of those who claim the name Christian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Higuera Smith, for a provocative and very challenging paper. Before we have Dr. Widman respond, I want to invite people to put questions up as we start our conversation after Dr. Widman responds in the chat. And when you put them up, if you could put also who you are and where you're from. If you're a student or a pastor or another professor, that would be great to know. So with that, Dr. Widman, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clifton Soderstrom. As you said earlier, I am the Director of Contextual and Lifelong Learning here at North Park Theological Seminary. And this is actually a recent appointment as of last month. So if you catch a whiff of a new car smell on me in my remarks, it's probably because of that. And what a great presentation, Dr. Smith. I'm an Enneagram 7, and I don't trust myself with staying on track. And so I'm going to actually read my response so I can make sure that I'm concise. Usually when I go off track, it's fun for me, but not so much fun for everybody else. So here we go. In my response, I want to thank you for your excellent work that you submitted for the Symposium called What is a Name? What is a Name Indeed? Your contribution to the Symposium looking at the destruction caused by the blind naming of white evangelicals hopefully will be read widely after this symposium. I found myself responding to your paper as Dr. Skinner did while reading Dr. Baker's last night. I had amens written on the manuscript in my notes, as well as the amens that were springing out of my heart. Bringing up Dr. Baker's work, I'm thankful that your presentation was prior to what we're talking about this morning. In fact, after the presentation last night and how it feeds into this, I woke up early this morning and worked on my response, actually starting over. Sadly, I missed the other sessions this morning, so please forgive. I would be remiss not to name my social location before I respond. As a white, cisgender, straight, male, nurtured in an evangelical context, it is not lost on me the endless points of blindness and ignorance that still lurk within me, that I embody and I've actually probably named in ignorance in the past. In other words, I'm very conscious about my incompetence. I have served in the various pastoral roles within the church, all on the West Coast before landing in academia. In fact, it was the 2016 election that revealed so much troubling fruit within the church that I sensed an invitation and a call to engage the discipleship of a younger generation that are leaving churches they were nurtured in, exactly like you say, Dr. Smith, primarily of the blindness and the ignorance of said church. Dr. Smith lets us know exactly where she's headed in the second paragraph of her work. And I read to remind us, because she states it so eloquently. By the 21st century, white evangelicals have co-opted the name Christian and have successfully employed it politically to reinscribe a racialized, gendered, anti-Jewish hierarchy on their form of Christianity while fostering ignorance among their congregants of the contingent and limited nature of their form of Christianity on the one hand, and its hierarchical genealogy on the other. They have done so by redefining the name while asserting that their definition is comprehensive for all Christianities. They have been equally adept at masking the racialized, anti-Jewish, and gendered nature of hierarchies they put forth. These developments have now crystallized into a movement whose social violence and at times physical threats of violence can be well documented. And then ending your work, you write, white evangelicals are demonstrating an uncomfortable reality, which is that racialized, Judaized, and gendered hierarchies are built into the warp and woof of Christianity throughout history. Can this be redeemed? This is the exact same question that was posed to me yesterday by a Black pastor and colleague that has been harassed and threatened by a white pastor and colleague who he used to serve alongside of, where threats of violence followed. Is there hope for the white evangelicals? This is the question you're asking us to wrestle with after reading your thesis. You develop your work by talking about the power of naming and the subsequent consequences when naming is done by blindness, or which you use, white ignorance. You quote Charles Mills on page 7 in bold font, and you already named this earlier in your presentation, that white ignorance as a cognitive phenomenon has to be clearly historicized, which is exactly what you do in your paper. You rightfully state that naming is political, hierarchical, and results in dehumanizing people and creating violence. Your charting of history of white evangelicalism reminded me of Krista Kobes Demez's work, Jesus and John Wayne, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And I highly recommend this text to be read alongside of Dr. Smith's work today. For the sake of supporting your claims, I found myself wandering in Genesis since it's early in the semester, and this is where we start 2 of my courses. In Genesis 1, we are taught that male and female are both image bearers. We read the familiar. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image, God created them, male and female, he created them. God names that male and female bear his image with a purpose of stewarding creation. Both bear God's image, both are to steward creation. In Genesis 2, the narrative gets more specific about the male-female creation. We read the following. Then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. So out of the ground, the Lord God formed every animal of the field, every bird of the air, and he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that's what its name. The man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. But for the man, there was not found a helper as his partner. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then he took one of his ribs and closed up the place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, this is at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of the man this one was taken. It's interesting to note that God did not instruct the man to name the woman. God instructed the man to name the animals. The word choice is interesting in that the man uses the phrase, this one that was presented to me in the same way that the animals were presented. God brought her to me in the same way that he brought animals to me. Man named animals and man named woman. While it's easy to romanticize this passage with the man's song and poetry, his naming of the woman after naming the animals is troubling. Now, I want to pause and give credit where credit is due. I would not have seen this in the text if I had not studied the text with a woman. She was the one that revealed this to me. So like last night we talked about, reading the text together across cultural barriers and context will actually provide a check to any kind of tribalism that we have within the text or blindness. Going back further, pulling on this thread a bit more, we said that after the talking snake incident, we see the man deflecting himself and blaming the woman. He scapegoats her to God, thus absolving himself of any responsibility. This one, by the way that you brought to me, gave me the fruit and I ate it. As we read along, we can see what the man does, which reinforces the power of naming her in Genesis 3:20. The man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living. While this is often chosen to preach during a Mother's Day sermon, I find it alarming that the man chooses to name her when he was never instructed to do so. She, this one, will be named mother, not image bearer, mother, not co-heir, mother, not co-steward. Thus, the patriarchy takes root. Man naming at will what he names, and women do not. She does not name in either creation narrative. She is named as lower than man, dare I say, on par with animals that man was naming. And this is dehumanizing. We know that it's important to acknowledge the narrative nature of the creation account. And so I'm actually daring to connect this narrative to what happens later. In Genesis 6:1-2, we read, "Then the people began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives." Early this morning, I dove down a rabbit trail to see who these sons of gods were and who these women were. In some translations are named the daughters of men. What I discovered is that there's many complexity about who the sons of God are believed to be. Some say they are divine beings or angels that came and took beautiful women as wives, hinting at sexual intercourse. What's problematic about that is that we are aware in Jesus' teaching about sexuality after death is that it doesn't exist. There's no giving and receiving in marriage in heaven. For the sake of my point this afternoon, I believe from what I've read from others is that the sons of God were signaling to powerful divine-like men, elevating these men as very close to God, almost divine, in a hierarchical way over women. These men were sons of God, where women were not offspring of God, but were offspring of men. This narrative precipitates the flood. The great wickedness spreading the earth is directly connected to what was happening here. These sons of God were taking wives, most likely without their consent. Rape is a likely possibility. God sees this, and it's a great injustice, a great evil. The naming of woman Eve in a hierarchical way from man dehumanizes her lower than himself, as with others he named, and led to a great evil that grieved God. If I were to meme this, I would say this is the very first name it, claim it. Because male named woman Eve, he could enact violence against her or claim her as a wife without her consent, or many other women as wives as well. Naming, as Dr. Smith rightfully states, can be a power that is abused, creating a hierarchy, dehumanization, and violence. As stated last night, when Europeans descended on the land we now stand on, we see the power of naming and the dehumanizing violence that ensues. My descendants named themselves Christian and named those they encountered as savages or less than human. They continually named others and were not white as less than human, maybe perhaps 3/5, and built institutions, systems, and cultures of violence stemming from wrongly naming. A willful white ignorance of what they were doing. In the same way that the man in Genesis scapegoated and gaslighted the woman and the violence that ensued, white evangelicals have a recorded history of scapegoating and gaslighting BIPOC communities and not taking any responsibility for the wrongful naming that they've done. I believe God sees this as a great evil within white evangelical church. These weeds were allowed to grow among the wheat and now have burst forth their noxious fruit. The reckoning of hundreds of years of improperly naming and the violence that has ensued is at our doorstep. And this is the reason why Dr. Smith poses her question to us about white evangelicals and the precipice we find ourselves on. Can any form of Christianity be committed to reject violent hierarchies? I would like to end my comments with a small mustard seed of hope. Because the kingdom of God is like yeast, a small amount affects the whole. And I would like to pivot and say that naming, which is done in ignorance and blindness, that creates hierarchies and dehumanizing violence, can also be used for good. Dr. Smith and a plethora of other theologians and Christian leaders are rightfully naming our history, naming the pain, naming the violence, naming the truth. And there will be a cost to doing that, which we are also witnessing. Naming the truth about white evangelicalism and the chaos in its wake will not be popular amongst white evangelicals that are willfully ignorant about our history. However, courageously telling the truth will help us to walk in light of the truth to new wineskins that we may or may not see the completion of. Finally, my other title at North Park is the director of Crux, an intentional living learning discipleship cohort for first-year students in the undergraduate side of our campus that is intentionally intercultural and city-centered. And I'm seeing the seeds of hope growing as they are told the truth. It's painful for some of them, but by the end of the year and following them forward, it becomes life-giving to how to engage others without violently naming them. This little cohort provides enough hope for me for what may be in the future. Lord, have mercy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bret. And speaking of naming, I've been given permission to use first names with my colleagues. So Kay, I'd like to give you the first opportunity to respond to Bret's paper or response.
Thank you. Thank you, Bret, for thoughtfully considering what I've had to say. I might interpret the Watchers myth a little differently. I see that as sort of a pre-existent mythic story that gets taken up. But that said, I think your larger point that you're trying to make is one that certainly I can affirm, that this power to name is political. And it can be used both ways. It can be used by those in power to dehumanize, and it can be used by those who have less power to speak truth to power, so to speak, to name, as you said at the end, to name the violence that is occurring. So I am certainly, as a person who is challenging the power to name that white evangelical Christianity has had, I certainly have to acknowledge my own power. I teach at a white evangelical institution, and I've been in these spaces my whole life, almost my whole life. So I am speaking in many ways as an insider, but also as an outsider, of course, as a woman who has taken my hits over the decades in many, many ways. So this power to name is complicated because it can be used to dehumanize, but also it can be used in ways that are redemptive. And I think that's what I liked the most about what you brought about. In the end, and I think I said this in my own presentation, part of me is, I think being the age I am, I'm in my 60s, and taking the hits I have and seeing this as something that seeing the kind of change I'd like to see as not likely in my own lifetime has been really discouraging. But at the same time, there's always been a remnant. And that remnant still has a voice. And that's who I want to empower. I want to be a part of that remnant that is speaking that truth. And there are people like you who are white evangelical men, cisgendered men, who are part of that remnant too. And we don't have to create divisions about this. So often what happens, and of course what the dominant system wants to happen, is that we attack one another and that they make it ad hominem, when really what we're talking about are epistemic systems that get used, and not individual acts. That's hard for us in the United States because we have our epistemology is so individualized. But I really do hope we can sort of leave this not with a pessimistic flavor, but with one that says, how can we who don't have a voice create a voice for others who don't have a voice? And collectively, maybe our voice is small and squeaky, but it's a voice that speaks redemptively. And that's something that I think is very doable in our lifetimes. Thanks.
Thank you both again. We will move now to a time of Q&A, and a reminder to put your questions up in the chat, and please tell me who you are so I can announce that as well with your question. The first question we have is from Nathaniel Rodriguez, and he is a North Park student. He says, "Thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding your interactions with students who identify as Catholic and reject the label Christian. Do you see this differing depending on the student's family culture? I ask because in Mexico, at least in central Mexico, Catholics, the dominant religious group, so by far, also choose not to identify as Christian and self-identify as Catholic, because to them the term Christian is equivalent to Protestant. How would this cultural dynamic influence our understanding of the social power of naming and its political force in setting and regulating norms?"
That's a great question. I like it because it's complex. So, because we're dealing with different power differentials, in Mexico and in Central America, you have the Catholic Church as the dominant power group. And here in the United States, you have Protestantism as dominant. So already you have a different kind of power game going on. But at the same time, there are some continuations, and in some ways, Nathaniel, your question reinforces my claim. That is the claim that colonizing, that white evangelical space comes out of the same kind of spaces as colonizing space, has had so much power in Mexico and in Central America that it's been able to there as well so convince everybody, including Catholics, that it defines what it is to be a Christian. Those of us who know history know that Christianity is, that there are forms of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, Catholic Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, as well as others. And so in history, Christianity should be an umbrella term that refers to everything. But because Protestant missionizing in Mexico and in Central America has been so adept at naming itself as Christians, even the powerful Catholic Church and its adherents have acknowledged that, in essence, have given up on that name, in essence. I get that. It's, I called myself evangelical for a long time, and you get to a point where you don't want to use that term anymore because you feel like it doesn't define who you are anymore. And I'm still struggling in that myself. By the same token, so on one hand, Catholics who say I'm not Christian have internalized the colonizers' message about themselves. But on the other hand, Catholics who say I'm not Christian may be very conscious of what the colonizers' message is and say, because the colonizers have used that label so effectively, we reject it. And that's that they have every right to do that. That's why it's so complex. And of course, we know that Catholic Christianity is a colonizing religion too, right? So it's very, very complex. And it has to be a decision by different groups. Some groups are going to reject that nomenclature very self-consciously. Others are going to not reject it, but just assume that they can't possibly be Christian because they're Catholic. That was the kind of Catholic I was referring to. So yeah, it's complex. And I'm glad you brought the question up to name that complexity.
The next question is also from a North Park Seminary MDiv student, Carrie Stevens. And she asks, how do those of us who have been victims to naming name the abusers who have harmed us without also victimizing them in some way? Can we call out wrongdoing or misnaming without leaving a mark of Cain, so to speak?
Well, again, that's a really, it's kind of a, what's the word, kind of a charged question, because Carrie, as you ask, you say, without also victimizing them. This is something that powerful abusers have always been able to successfully wield, is the argument that if they get accused of abuse, even though they have carried out that abuse, they have become the victim. We've seen this with Jerry Falwell. We've seen this with Jim and Tammy Baker. We've seen this with a number of evangelical leaders, people in the Southern Baptist. The Southern Baptist denomination is struggling with this as well. So that is the charge of the abuser, that if you name their abuse, you have victimized them. And we have to reject that assumption right there. An abuser is not a victim. An abuser is an abuser. So to name them as an abuser does not create them as victim. It's to name what has occurred. So leaving the mark of Cain, my argument is that those of us who call out white evangelicals are calling out sin and saying, we're asking you to name yourself as contingent, just like everybody else does. Black Christians talk about the Black church. Indigenous Christians talk about indigenous Christianity. It's only the white Christianity that names itself as Christianity without any qualifier. So I don't see any concern about leaving a mark of Cain. White evangelicalism would never accept that designation, and I certainly wouldn't want to put that designation on them, and I don't think I have the social power to do that anyway. Bret, would you like to add to this?
I'm in total agreement. Thank you.
The next question is from Dennis Edwards, who is our New Testament professor at North Park. Dr. Higuera Smith, do you have any additional thoughts about how marginalized groups take the names, perhaps even insults, given to them and make them their own badges of honor? I think of the term Christian in the first century and Black in the 70s, perhaps also queer. When Black was an indicator of shame, we claimed Black is beautiful. Is there something to turning the insults around?
I got to think about that a little. Dr. Edwards, yeah, that's, is there a way to, I mean, you're right, there's a history of that. Those who have been pushed to the periphery have changed that to name themselves. Man, I want to open that up to others. I don't know that I have a response. I think it's really an interesting observation, almost a rhetorical question for us to consider. Any others have a way of, or maybe Dennis, you have some thoughts on that yourself even.
I get to exercise the privilege of being the behind the scenes person here. Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot because I've been doing work in First Peter, and that's where he says in 4:16, they call you Christian, and he says, he even uses the language of shame, disgrace, and says, consider it an honor. He says, that they call you by this name. And now, of course, we carry the name Christian boldly, but it was an insult most likely in the first century, people of Christ is an insult. So I think there's something empowering, but it's happening from the marginalized group, right? The marginalized group is deciding themselves that what you're throwing at me for shame, I'm going to wear it, and we're going to wear it as honors. But it's that group's decision, So there's something empowering in that, I think. But it struck me because I really appreciated what you were saying about naming and how you hit, with race, with Judaism, with women. That was really very poignant for me. Anyway, it just had me thinking about that reimagining or reinterpreting.
And maybe Nathaniel's question about Catholics claiming that name, contemporary Catholics claiming that name as an empowering way to speak against the newer forms of colonization could be an example of that.
Yeah, very good.
I like that line of thinking. I think it's worth considering.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I would add to that. Well, actually, our own tradition in the Evangelical Covenant, which emerges out of German and Scandinavian pietism, the word pietist was a pejorative term originally, and we've claimed that as part of our history, and that name is that's probably no longer as well known. I wonder if either you or Bret have any thoughts around the term evangelicalism or evangelical, because that's a question that our own denomination is talking about right now. Do we want to keep that name given all that's happening that you named so clearly in your paper? Is it a name that we should keep and lean into that and stay with, certainly for those of us who are white evangelicals, with our white brothers and sisters who in the struggle for equity in our country and in our world?
I do. So in our history, we'll just talk about our history. We were, let me get me this right, Michelle, Swedish Evangelical Mission Covenant. Is that what it was?
Something like that.
And there was an intentionality of dropping the word Swedish. And that was because it was, even though that was a name that was held in pride, we are from Sweden, there's a sense of pride, it was also exclusionary to say that if you were not Swedish, you couldn't be a part of that. Well, we did drop that name, but it's taken us quite a while to understand ourselves as not Swedish. But the choice to rename was important. I think that the same is true now for the word evangelical. I do think that being a bearer of good news, of glad tidings, is always good for called us to be as followers of Christ. But if that word carries bad news, and that we're constantly trying to explain the bad news away, people don't have a lot of patience with that. And so for me, I'm interested in a conversation about maybe going back to mission covenant, because that too can be a negative word because of colonization. So it is a live conversation for me about what we should be named. It's an identity piece.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Bret. We have another question from Jeffrey Parker, who is also a student at North Park, living in Alameda, California. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Higuera Smith and Dr. Widman. Considering the names that the dominant group and those in power have forced upon those who are marginalized and oppressed, can those who are marginalized truly eradicate the names and labels that are imposed upon them by the dominant?
Bret, you want to take that?
Such a complex one.
And I'm thinking of Latinx and Hispanic, and this is Latino Heritage Month, and that's an example that keeps coming up currently.
If I understand it, I think I don't want to put the weight of this on marginalized communities. I think the weight of it has to be on the dominant culture. That's what I would say. So we carry the weight of having the conversation about name. And because I think what we do is we defer too much and say, you have to carry the weight of this, rather than listening to them and then advocating for how they want to be named. I guess that's what I try to do.
I like that. I think also, I don't know about eradicate, but what we can do is not internalize it. The powerful will name the marginalized all they want. It's up to those on the periphery to accept that naming or to internalize that naming or to reject it. And we can't reject it unless we see the discursive move that's being played out, unless we see the history, unless we historicize it, unless we see that this is an epistemological move, it's a power move, and it's meant to be cloaked and masked. Once the emperor's clothes, once we see that the emperor has no clothes, then the name itself dissipates in its power. Its power comes in its mystification, in its claims to be divinely ordained, its claims to be ordained in nature. Once it's demystified and we see it for what it is, then its power kind of dissipates. I don't feel that the naming and labeling that the dominant culture has on me shapes me in any sense. So because I hopefully have not internalized it. I'm sure I've internalized some of it because, I'm also white, even though I'm bicultural, I'm still white. I'm a white Latina. So yeah, I think that's the key, is to demystify it so that those on the margin don't internalize it.
We have a question from Kathy Brawley, who used to teach at North Park Seminary. I know of times when being named has been an empowering event. Once, while volunteering in Haiti, where women are not necessarily seen as equals to men and certainly not able to pastor back then, an older gentleman greeting me one morning as my pastor. It was an overwhelming event. How do we utilize our ability to call into being things we see in others, most likely on a personal level, but maybe in a general way as well?
Yeah, I think this is the beauty. Once we've demystified the hierarchy, and we begin to see that women are equal to men and also don't have some sort of biologically determined roles that we must fit into that are actually bourgeois Western roles, then we're pastoras, we're reverendas, we're bishops, we're priests. We're operating in the task of proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ and the power of the word that has been that we women and we people who have been marginalized and peripherized, that we found liberating. So yes, as the more that we begin to make visible this mystification, and in that sense render it powerless, then the more those of us who have been pushed to the periphery by that system will be named and will be acknowledged and will be able to carry out the task of proclaiming the gospel the way that many of us feel called.
So I don't have a question in the chat, so I'm going to also take the privilege of being part of the group and raise a question myself. And in thinking about what both of you are saying, and Kay, your paper, and Bret, your response, what role do you think the naming of God has in this whole conversation? And I'm thinking anything from, Pseudo Dionysius and how he, the names of God and how he's using that. But how can the naming of God play a role either to interrupt these problematic abuses of power or to further traumatize?
Bret, you want to take that first? I went first last.
I mean, it's such a large question, but it's interesting that I just thought about this morning. There was somebody that contacted me that was in a female of color in trauma, and it was real. It is real. And so because I knew the story, I did what Jesus did himself when he named God like a mother hen. If I would have named God a different way, that could have been further harming to her experience. And so I said, I'm hoping the God who is a mother hen embrace you under her wing. And I think that being skilled at ourselves and all the names that are mentioned in scripture and using them pastorally can really be redemptive.
Beautiful. Yeah, I mean, the naming of God is deeply political also, isn't it? It's very interesting that the second commandment, thou shalt make no graven image, has resulted both in Judaism and Islam as a refusal to engrave images of God. And yet we've engraved the metaphor of God as male in our collective consciousness so powerfully that many people can't conceptualize God in any other sense. I spent a couple of years in living in Asia, where the pronoun in Chinese is neutered. It doesn't have gender associated with it. And so a friend of mine who was Korean with similar situation, had said that when it wasn't until she came to the United States where she really began to see God as so male, because of this difference just in the grammar of languages. And so I do think that we have all sorts of metaphors for God, not only the mother hen, but God has a womb. The word rachamim comes from womb. God births us. God is the rock that bears us. So God has wombs. El Shaddai, God, the one who nurses us at the breast. Shad means breast. So God has breasts. God has a womb. God gives birth to us. Interestingly, there's nowhere that talks about God's male genitalia, but all sorts of metaphors for God's female genitalia. Does that mean God is a female? God is above gender. I mean, this is why, in some way, I think we've created an inscription. We violated the second of the 10 commandments, where we've inscribed maleness on God. People say, well, Jesus called God Father. Yes, but Jesus also used the metaphor of God as the woman with the lost coin and the mother hen. These are all metaphors. So the conception of God as great emperor, I forget, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I can't remember the name of the woman who was speaking yesterday, but when she was talking about Josh Hawley and his conceptualization of Jesus, Christos Imperator, these are political moves. And for those of us, Janelle Baker, thank you. I want to give you credit, Janelle. So I'll good credit to you for that. But it's so important for those of us who are experiencing microaggressions or experiencing the social violence of the dominant group to ourselves be able to name these, because naming can be liberating, as Kathy brought out, as well as dehumanizing. If those on the periphery can name, then it can be very powerful. And that's true, I think, in our naming of God and our conceptualization of God and Jesus. It's very important for us to think that through and to historicize that. What's going on here? What are the models that we're using? What are the models we're choosing not to use? What's at stake when we use only male metaphors of God and suppress the female metaphors of God? Those are really important questions that I think any kind of informed, theologically formed and trained Christian leader needs to be asking themselves.
Thank you both so much. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So Kay or Bret, do you have any closing remarks or anything you'd like to leave us with?
Thank you. It's been great to have this conversation. If any of you want to ask further questions, I'm sure you have my paper available and you have contact information. I'd love to stay engaged with people on these issues.
Thank you again for a challenging and just wonderful paper. I enjoyed reading it and enjoyed hearing you talk about it. And Bret, thank you for your response, and Dr. Edwards for getting us all together. We will break now until 2:40, at which time Tim Milanovic will be doing a paper called Who Can Lead a Flock of Shepherds, with a response by Christy Rendazzo. So we'll see you soon. Thank you.